A severe thunderstorm gave me an ideal opportunity to test the Fastfire and the Fast Striker under adverse conditions. Initially here I am taking the whole Fastfire cube and cutting it first in half and then in quarters. I'm going to try to use the least amount possible initially to see if I can pull off this test. At this point, my plan is to create a pile of wood shavings that I can use once the Fastfire is ignited to keep the fire going a little ways, and gradually work up to the pile of longer shavings you see in the bottom right of the image, and perhaps eventually even the kindling I have leaning on the split log in the far right of the picture. However, as you can see from the weather, the conditions are rapidly devolving. The rain is picking up. The surface of the bricks that I'm using as a base for the fire is already coated in water. The tinder that I am shaving off of this stick is getting soaked almost as soon as it comes off the knife blade. So this is making really perfect conditions for a very, very adverse condition test. So here I am in the first attempt of trying to use the Fastfire in the rain. I'm scraping powder off the top of the Fastfire here, trying to create something with more surface area that would ignite with the Fastfire Striker. But as you're going to see here, the grooves in the top of the Fast Striker that have been carved by the hacksaw blade have quickly filled with rainwater, making this a very difficult task to get anything to strike. I'm moving now to my Mora knife, first the back of it, which is ineffectual, and then something I never do because of worrying about edge retention with knives. I'm actually using the cutting edge of the knife to try to get a spark. As you can see, my technique is also devolving under the conditions. I'm feeling sort of a typical pressure, if you will, to combat the conditions of the rain to try to get a blaze going as quickly as possible. And this is causing me, under these conditions, to use perhaps less than my best fire starting technique. I thought about redoing this portion of the test, but it occurs to me that if you're in a desperate situation trying to use a survival tool like the Fastfire, you're likely to find yourself under somewhat similar constraints, under similar pressures and tensions here. As you can see, I'm getting some sparks off of this rod, but it's very difficult under these conditions to try to control the throwing of the spark so that it can actually reach and ignite the Fastfire cubes and or shavings that I have now piled up on that little pile of tinder. You'll note again in the background and also in the foreground that the rain is coming down heavily enough now that it is actually ponding on the flat surface of my driveway. So conditions definitely not good at all for what I'm trying to do here. But again, I wanted to see what a worst case scenario would look like as I'm using this. Trying to scrape off a new surface using my knife here on the ferro rod. One of the problems that I had noted previously, as I mentioned, was the grooves that have been cut by the hacksaw teeth, and those sort of prevent subsequent attempts with the hacksaw blade from doing as much as they might. I think the grooves on the blade, on the hacksaw blade, tend to fall into the grooves that they have created and therefore don't remove much material. But my knife isn't doing much better at this point. So really it's time for me to come up with an additional plan. I thought I'd try out some cheap Coleman matches that I had sitting around. Unfortunately, that blurred attempt to show them to the camera also got the striking surface of them wet. So as you're going to see, while I initially have experienced some success in terms of lighting the match, that will quickly go south as well. The energy of the match is largely consumed here in trying to dry the exterior of the Fastfire cube. You can actually see rain coming down between me and the camera lens. It's coming down fairly heavily here. Rain is notoriously difficult to capture on film. But at this point the box is sodden, it's more or less useless, I'm going to a lighter that I had in my pocket. Up to this point it has been dry in my pocket. That will change subsequently. But here, despite all the mess of the conditions, the Fastfire has ignited. Now logically, what I'm going to do here is a rookie mistake. I'm going to eventually smother the Fastfire, despite its better nature. You'll see if you look closely at it that the flame continues. It'll flare up from time to time through the tinder, as it just is doing now. And so it really is requiring a fair amount of effort on my part to smother it. However, what I'm trying to do is scrape off some shavings that will have at least one side that is somewhat dry to give that eighth of a piece of tinder, or maybe it's a quarter of a piece that I'm using here, a chance to actually ignite the shavings. The problem is that it's basically sitting in a puddle of water on top of the brick, and eventually I'm going to smother it and put it out, leading me to another attempt with the lighter. Initially, the first rotation of the striker ignited the gas, but now it is wet from a raindrop or raindrops that have fallen on the lighter. And the problem with the lighter of this sort, of course, is that if it gets wet, it becomes absolutely useless. So now what I'm trying to do is take the knife and break up the Fastfire and to expose more surface area, and to try once again to use the hacksaw blade to get any kind of spark off of this Fast Striker ferrocerium rod. The rod is pretty sodden. Obviously you can wipe the water off the surface of it, and generally that doesn't cause a problem. I'm striking out with the rod, I'm striking out with the lighter, and so my next plan at this point is to go to a different fire steel and see if perhaps I could have better luck. This is the Exotac Polystriker XL. It is a little bit drier than the Fast Striker from SOLKOA was, but as you can see, the striker itself is also producing far more sparks with this particular rod than did the SOLKOA. And one of the observations that I will write up in my written review is that the hacksaw blade seems to be a limiting factor to the utility of the Fast Striker when you're dealing with adverse conditions. I think the Polystriker XL, with its specialized striker design as a carbide striker, is more effective and would be a better pair with the Fastfire product. For me personally, if I were using it in my kit, for reasons that you'll see here. It's very easy for me to control a spark and throw a spark with the Polystriker XL. Much more difficult with the SOLKOA Fast Strike. But that said, the SOLKOA Fast Strike under better conditions has worked absolutely beautifully. So it's really under the most extreme conditions that I was testing here that it experienced some difficulty, and that it exposed the weakness, in my opinion, of the hacksaw blade as a striker. Obviously the hacksaw blade does have other utility in a variety of fronts. You can use it to saw metal, of course, as I will demonstrate in my written review. Once the Fastfire has taken hold, you will see, despite it having been wet, that it is burning with a fairly tenacious, bright flame, particularly when I add this other eighth of a cube into the mix here and actually begin to think a little bit more lucidly and practically about building a fire, using a backrest for it to create a more appropriate oxygen flow. It's burning extremely well. The challenge that I'm having here is, at this point, dealing with more or less sodden materials to try to start the fire. I could have used smaller tinder. For example, I could have used something like birch bark that is more inclined to burn even under wet conditions. But my goal was to try to put the pressure on the Fastfire itself to see what it could do as a tinder. And I have to say I'm pretty impressed by it. Certainly under these conditions, these are not great conditions, even though the rain is more or less tapered off now into occasional drizzle. I'm dealing with wet materials here that have been soaked by the recent rain, that are still literally dripping wet in some cases. Some of the material that I picked up I actually had to shake water off, as you'll see me do right here, in order to get it to actually be remotely viable as tinder. But basically, the Fastfire did what it was supposed to do once I got it ignited. So it's something that I am very favorably impressed by, particularly in light of dry weather testing as well, or testing under better conditions. So here the focus is on just showing you the evolution of this little fire as I'm still using the wet tinder, wanting to see a bed of coals begin to appear under the bottom side, and also wanting to see some blackening of the wood that I'm using. Toward that end, I am actually batoning the tinder in half to expose one or two sides that are dry on the inside, with the hope or goal of building my flame higher. By now the flame is reasonably well established, and it's something that I have some confidence in that it will be able to endure, that it's getting hot enough now that it's drying the surface moisture that's on the wood that I'm using. I gave up on the box of matches, and so even though I had only one or two left, I'm burning the box here, splitting some more tinder down the middle to add to my little blaze. And as you can see, there is some blackening now. You can see the coals in there. The Fastfire, of course, is long gone. And at this point, my thoughts turned back to the variables of this particular test. And I thought I would try the Exotac striker on the Fastfire rod to see how it would work. As you can see, I'm having to sort of scrape again some of the grooving that was created by the hacksaw blade off the Fast Strike ferro rod. Once I do that, it's striking sparks without any problem. When I return to the hacksaw blade, again these are improved conditions, you'll see that it is also throwing sparks. Again, the surface of the ferro rod that I was using at this point had been smoothed by the Exotac striker, and so those teeth are not going into pre-created grooves, but are actually creating new grooves and are scraping off more material again. And it seems to be doing a better job now. My observations then from this adverse condition test are that the Fastfire product is extremely resilient despite the adverse conditions, and even though it had been soaked by heavy rain, it was still igniting quite readily once I had a controllable enough ignition source, whether it was a lighter or the Exotac polystriker. Definitely the larger size cube tends to work better. It might have been interesting to test with a full-size cube under these conditions, but I really wanted to put this material to the test and see how it could do with the least amount of help possible. I did note that the Fast Strike ferro rod and hacksaw striker seemed to struggle in the heavy rain. I think most anything would. You notice the matches did to some degree in the lighter as well. Nevertheless, the Fast Strike did ignite, it did start a fire, and it basically got the job done. I'm very impressed by the Fastfire then, a little bit less impressed by the Fast Strike, but I need to give it its due with other tests and other conditions to see how well it performs there. I apologize for the length of this recording, but I thought it might be useful for you to see the whole process and to see the struggle, if you will, to get a fire under these conditions. Obviously, there are other things that I could have done or things that I might have done better to get a fire going, but we don't always have optimal conditions, or our brains are not always thinking in optimal fashion when we're trying to do something like that, when we have various environmental or psychological pressures on us. So I thought I'd leave all of that into this video. If you have any questions, please let me know.